I'm not sure about you, but I do remember the days where a 6-inch smartphone was considered pretty large, and nowadays they're pretty much non-existent because the smartphone industry has gone for the larger scale form factor. Thankfully, there are few that still exist, such as the Samsung S25, not to be confused with the Plus or the Ultra, which, as the names might suggest, are actually larger. This comes in at 6.2 inch, and it has got flagship specifications. Now, at the time of filming and in UK, it's available in 3 different storage configurations, where you've got 128GB that can be found for roughly £700, 256GB that can be found for roughly £750, and then you have got the 512GB model that can be found for a whopping £850. All of them come with 12GB of RAM and are otherwise near on identical. Now, in this review, you can see if this relatively smaller size smartphone competes with larger alternatives, and of course, if it's actually worth its price tag. So let's kick things off and talk about its design, and here it has got a small form factor for a modern flagship, coming in with a 6.2 inch display. It weighs in at just 162 grams, making it really ideal for one-handed operation, at least in my opinion. It also does look the part with a multitude of color finishes: blue, black, coral red, pink gold, navy, silver shadow, mint, and the pictured icy blue. So yes, indeed, you can find a color that really suits your personality. Now, elsewhere, you have got a glass front and also back. The latter is very much appreciated because it doesn't suffer from any sort of fingerprints, although you might want to be mindful about it suffering from any sort of harsh treatment. The original S25 that I actually got in from the manufacturer was completely smashed up from the courier. Nothing to do with Samsung, of course, but just something to be mindful about. So therefore, you might want to pair it up with a case, despite the fact that both at the front and the back, you've got Gorilla Glass Victus 2 and an aluminium frame. Elsewhere, you've got IP68 rating, therefore giving you water and dust resistance, useful in certain scenarios. Now, while that's all great, it is worth pointing out that the phone does not sit flush on a table, and that is due to its triple camera foray that is found at the back, and as a result, it's constantly rocking, and therefore reinstates the fact that you might want to look into a case, of course, if you're going to be using the smartphone in such a way. Furthermore, you've got no extra buttons, in other words, a customizable button, which would have been great to see specifically at this price point. Alas, some of its competitors do offer that, and it does make the Samsung look a little bit cheaper in this department. Nonetheless, the buttons on the right-hand side are very nice to press, and they feel pretty premium, and you've got a SIM tray found at the bottom, which sits alongside a USB Type-C port. And no, before you ask, you haven't got a 3.5mm jack, which I agree is quite disappointing, but is something that you should come to expect with a lot of smartphones these days. Equally, you would expect some sort of biometric capabilities, and indeed over here the S25 has got an ultrasonic fingerprint sensor that's located underneath the display. It worked pretty well in my own tested scenarios, although I did find it to be sometimes a little bit slow to respond, especially if I compare and contrast it yet again to some of the other phones out there that I've reviewed. I just felt that it's not exactly the fastest, especially when it comes to its overall animation, although that is somewhat software related as well. Now, you have of course got Face Unlock, which you can pair this up with. However, just bear in mind it's not going to be as secure as using your fingerprint or indeed a pin or pattern, because it's not using 3D biometric data. Now, this does actually bring me onto the 120Hz LTPO 6.2 inch AMOLED display, because it actually does very much look the part. And given it's got that LTPO technology, it means it's got the full range of 1 to 120 Hz, meaning that everything feels quite dynamic and very fluid. Furthermore, you've also got a resolution of 1080 by 2340, and given the overall form factor, it means that everything looks pretty sharp. However, when it comes to the overall brightness, I found myself a little bit disappointed, not only for a phone of its price tag, but also given Samsung's pedigree. Here, using my calibrators, I noticed a maximum brightness of 440 nits, which was in the auto mode, while in the maximum mode, without auto mode enabled, it went up to 403 nits, and with the extra brightness mode, for some given reason, it dropped down to 320 nits. It's nice to see, however, you've got a great minimum brightness of 0.89 nits, meaning that it can be used in a very pitch black scenario. Now, I would like to point out over here that the brightness figures were actually pretty disappointing, namely if you compare and contrast it with some other smartphones that I've tested, which hit the 600 to 800 nits range. Of course, these are often quite much lower than what the manufacturer is claiming, which is often because they're using HDR and a certain test window. Moving swiftly on, we get on to its camera setup, and quite honestly, I was actually left disappointed in this department more than anything with the S25. Now let me explain. First off, you have got a 50 megapixel main f1.8 wide lens with OIS, a 10 megapixel f2.4 telephoto with OIS and 3 times optical zoom, and a pretty lackluster 12 megapixel f2.2 ultra wide. The latter didn't fare too well in my test, and it does look a lot more washed out, as you might come to expect from an ultra-wide lens, namely with a 12 megapixel count. Indeed, it really doesn't compare with some of the other phones that I've recently tested, which have got a far higher megapixel count and furthermore far better capabilities, be it in terms of the aperture or indeed the amount of light they can draw in. Indeed, over here when it came to low light photography, I felt the ultra-wide lens struggled the most. Of course, you've got night mode as well that you can utilize. As for the overall main lens, at 1 to 3 times zoom, I felt that the phone was pretty decent, and the vast majority of consumers getting this phone will very much be pleasantly surprised at how the phone can capture the amount of light and also image. I found the overall color tones were pretty good, albeit in terms of the classic Samsung warmer tone, but here I think it's pretty good for social media sharing. But when it comes to comparing and contrasting this phone with some other phones out there, for example, the Google Pixel 9 or indeed some of the larger phones out there which come in at roughly the same sort of price tag, well, in my opinion, it gets really trounced. Be it in terms of normal lighting conditions, low light conditions, or when it comes to zooming in at 30 times digital zoom, you can really notice that there's a lot more blurriness and image noise that is present. That's not something that you'll normally come across on a flagship device, and in all honesty, I don't think that's something that you should come to expect when looking at a premium device like the S25. Furthermore, I should emphasize over here that the camera technology hasn't overly changed from the previous generation models. And in some instances, you could argue that Samsung is trying to upsell you the Plus or even the Ultra models, which do offer far better camera qualities, at least from what I have seen. Effectively, what I'm trying to highlight over here is the camera quality in this day and age for the S25 is actually pretty disappointing. But for a lot of consumers out there, I think you'll still be perfectly happy with the amount of quality and light that you get within the lens. But just bear in mind what I did mention before, that there's some other alternatives out there that will provide you far better still imaging capabilities. Similarly, the same sort of comments could be said about its selfie camera, where you've only got a 12 megapixel f2.2 wide lens with dual pixel PDAF, which stands for phase detection autofocus. From my own tests, I found that the overall color tones and skin tones were pretty good, although yet again being a little bit more on the warm side. And the autofocus did a tremendous job, at least in my opinion, when it came to taking photos or indeed videos. But when it came to zooming in, I did notice that due to the lower megapixel count in comparison to some of its competitors, yet again it didn't quite compete. And while the portrait mode can be useful in certain instances, you will again notice some of the limitations of the S25. However, the saving grace, in my opinion, is when it comes to its recording capabilities, which is not normally something that I kind of praise when it comes to Android smartphones, because a lot of them are actually pretty lackluster. Here, not only can you shoot at 8K at 30 FPS, 4K and Full HD at 60 and 30 FPS, and HD at 30 FPS, you can also shoot at slow-mo with 4K at 120 FPS and Full HD at 120 and 240 FPS. What I found that not only due to the overall capabilities in terms of resolution and refresh rates, which are pretty good, but the overall stabilization that you're getting is absolutely incredible. I'd go as far as saying it's probably one of the best phones out there on the market, be it if you're looking at an iPhone to an Android device, this actually does a stonkingly good job. From my tests of walking or running about, it kept a really still image, and it didn't feel jittery or suffer from the likes of EIS, which normally kicks in with some of its rivals. This makes the phone look really good when it comes to recording, and it really left me jaw-dropped. I wish a lot more smartphones had this sort of capabilities. Equally over here, when it came to taking selfie videos, it also did a good job. It can also shoot at UHD and FHD at 60 and 30 FPS and HD at 30 FPS, meaning yet again you've got good sort of versatility, and it's great to see that you can shoot 60 FPS at 4K. Now, continuing on with some of the positives of the S25, we have to talk about its chipset performance, because here you have got the flagship Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Elite, which gives you an octa-core CPU and an Adreno 830 GPU. You've also got 12GB of RAM that's paired up with that. In Geekbench 6, I actually noted the highest score that I've tested so far, with a single core score of 2,965 and a multi-core score of 9,830. Now, intriguingly, in comparison to some of the other phones that I've tested, which also have a Snapdragon 8 Elite, where I noticed a tail off in terms of performance was in GFX Bench. Here you can see that there was an FPS range from 37 up to 228, which is certainly not bad to say the least, but in comparison to some of the other phones that have a top tier processor, well, here the S25 really does have a lackluster performance. And I suspect this is just due to thermal throttling. Samsung has tried to retain the amount of speed and indeed capabilities of the phone, namely when it gets hot, and therefore when it came to running some intensive benchmarks or indeed gaming for prolonged amount of times, I noticed a little bit of a tail off in terms of the overall performance that I was getting. Make no mistake, it's still actually really good, but here it's another compromise that you should be mindful about for getting a slightly smaller size smartphone. Now, one thing I don't feel has been compromised, however, is the overall software experience. Now, make no mistake, it's not going to give you that stock Android feel, and as someone who used to do ROM and kernel flashing on the Samsung Galaxy S1 and S3, I do think a lot has changed since then. Indeed, over here, the manufacturer shipped out Android 15, and you actually promised up to a whopping 7 major updates, meaning that if you're going to be keeping this phone for over 7 years, then you'll be pleased to know that you're still going to be protected when it comes to security vulnerabilities. It's also great to see that you have got the One UI interface, which is running on version 7, at least at the time of filming. Now, the combination of all of this actually does lead for a really good consumer experience. Again, certain individuals out there will prefer a bit more of a less bloated feel, but for the vast majority of individuals out there looking at the S25, I do think the manufacturer has blended in a good amount of features while also keeping it relatively simple. Furthermore, you've got a bunch of AI tools that are built in, as you might come to expect from a flagship device and indeed in this modern era. These are actually natively built in using Google Gemini, and the integration is actually done pretty well with the likes of Circle to Search and among a few others. And also you've got some Galaxy AI tools which can be quite handy. The thing that I feel that a lot of people will be using the most often is actually via the camera app. See, here you've got the likes of the Magic Erase tool as such, and it actually does a tremendous job. In fact, you can even draw certain images and it will actually generate them for yourself. It's actually quite fun to do, and I think here a lot of individuals will be utilizing this tool, and given how good it works and how quickly it does its job, I think you will actually be pleasantly surprised. Now, while that's all very well and good, how long will the phone actually last? Given its smaller form factor and its comparatively small battery pack of 4000 mAh, you might expect pretty shocking battery life. Well, thankfully that's not the case, and is actually quite the opposite. In my battery rundown test, I netted a whopping 28 hours and 36 minutes. Indeed, as you'll be able to see from the graph, that's actually a lot better than one might expect, and far better than a lot of its competitors. Given its overall form factor, that's actually even more impressive. Now, this means that you can run the phone for roughly 1.5 to 2 days of light to medium usage, and if you're a heavy user, such as if you're a mobile gamer, then expect sub 1.5 days. Now, that's actually really good, and in my opinion, I don't think you'll be reaching for a charger all that frequently. Speaking of which, however, it is disappointing that this phone is limited to 25 watts of wired charging capabilities, meaning that you can go from 0 to 50% in roughly half an hour. And of course, it'll take you a lot longer to reach 100%. In comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, that's actually pretty disappointing. Now, you have also got reverse charging capabilities of 7.5 watts, and you've also got 15 watts of wireless charging capabilities, which can be handy if you prefer to go fully wireless. Now to conclude, I would like to talk about some of the other features, and here you've got tri-band Wi-Fi with version 7 supported, therefore meaning that if you've got an appropriate router setup, you'll have ultra-fast connectivity. On that note, it's great to see that you've got Bluetooth version 5.4 with some of the major codecs supported, such as LDAC and aptX, meaning that you can wirelessly stream to certain Bluetooth devices, such as earphones or headphones, without much sort of transmission loss, meaning you can get the utmost audio fidelity. On that note, you've also got stereo speakers with Dolby Atmos support. I actually found that the latter can be enabled and disabled and also customized, which is very much appreciated. In my case, I felt that Dolby Atmos worked well when watching videos and indeed movies, and when I was listening to music, I tend to disable it because it gave me a bit more of an accurate reproduction. But of course here you can play around with it, and you've also got a pretty comprehensive equalizer which you can also customize the sound. It also does get pretty loud, at least in my opinion. However, certain individuals online have claimed that it's not as loud as the previous generation models. Frankly, I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue, but just something I thought I should highlight. Elsewhere, you've got dual SIM support, which is very much appreciated, including eSIM, therefore making it very handy if you're going to be regularly traveling abroad. And then you have got 128, 256 and 512 gigabytes of storage. It is a little bit disappointing here that the manufacturer has started off the S25 at 128 gigabytes because it would have been great to see it as an entry point of 256 gigabytes, namely if you compare it to some of its modern competitors. Here, I do think it's gone somewhat of the Apple route because a lot of Apple devices also have a similarly lower amount of storage. And given that you might be taking a lot of photos and videos, namely at higher resolution such as 4K or 8K, then you're going to quickly fill up that storage. And this is actually quite important because you've not got any sort of expandable storage to play around with. So with all that in mind, can I see myself recommending the Samsung S25? Well, in a nutshell, if you're looking for flagship specs, at least when it comes to its chipset, its display, and also its battery life, then in terms of the Android world, the S25 is certainly something that you might want to consider. It will very much compete with the likes of the Google Pixel 9, although that phone will offer you better camera performance. Elsewhere, you have also got the older generation Samsung line, which you might also want to look at least if you can find it brand new or indeed in a good use condition. Aside from this, however, I would strongly urge you to look at some of the alternatives out there, such as my personal favorite is the Poco F7 Ultra. Given the overall price it comes in at, it completely demolishes the S25 in pretty much every single department other than the overall battery life. And there are some other phones out there that you might indeed want to consider, and they'll be down in the description below for your own consideration. Indeed, these phones offer you much more bang for your buck and indeed provide you much better performance across the board, albeit at a larger form factor. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of the S25 down in the comment section below and if you'd pick it over rival alternatives. And if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.